Jack and I are both vets who now find ourselves in New York. But Jack, why don't you tell us a little bit more about your background?
Sure. Well, thanks for having me, Adam. I am originally from Sleepy Hollow, New York. Joined the military in 2002. Served in Ranger Battalion and Special Forces. Left the military in 2010. Went to Columbia as a older student. I graduated at I guess I was 31 by the time I finished. Majored in political science, and eventually found my way into journalism and have been working as a journalist, as an investigative journalist, for probably close to a decade at this point. I've reported from Syria, from Iraq, from Kurdistan, from the Philippines, a few other places. But a lot of my work is focused on the special operations and intelligence communities.
The reason you're here today actually is to talk about an investigation you did into airstrikes in Afghanistan and specifically Helmand Province. And this is something that interests me as well because I served in an Anglico unit, or an air naval gunfire liaison company unit. So we live and breathe airstrikes. What we know is that the rate of airstrikes have increased exponentially. So I want to make this real for the viewers. I'm going to read off a journal entry that you included in your article. And by the way, the article can be found at odyssey.com. But I want to include this handwritten journal entry, and I'm going to read it now. It starts here, and this is from an operator. My productivity today was derailed. We killed 2 innocent men and a charger. They were on a motorcycle, and by dumb luck drove into the same intersection as our target as the hellfire struck. We were trying to kill a guy with a radio I'd found earlier in the day. He drove right through the blast and kept going. I watched passerby load the bodies into a truck and drive them to a hospital. They are all dead.
Yeah, and what's interesting about that is when you look at the DoD numbers, they list a instance of civilian casualties of collateral damage in Afghanistan that day for that strike in Helmand, but they only list one fatality when there was 3. So I don't know if they decided the child must be the civilian and the other 2 who just happened to be there. I guess we're just marking them up as Taliban now. So it's a very sad instance of collateral damage. And when I talked to JTAX about that incident, they were kind of pissed about it, honestly. They were like, there are safeguards that are supposed to be in place. So you have one drone pilot who is really focused in on the target that you're going to hit. There should be somebody else who is zoomed out so that you can see if someone else is coming into the intersection, that there are civilians that are about to intersect with the target you're trying to strike.
We talk about shoddy targeting. I want to go back to the journal entry itself. What is a charger, just for those who...
It's the military lingo that was being used at the time for a child. In this case, it was a toddler. Just like, I mean, we have these kind of codes for everything, like a crow, or, all these different terminologies we use. Jackpot on the objective, touchdown, different ops skids or code words that are used on radio traffic.
Okay. I want to walk us through how the rules of engagement evolved over time for these strikes. I mean, when I was in Afghanistan in 2012, I remember we were using HIMARS. We weren't using regular artillery because we thought the risk of collateral damage was too high. The rules of engagement were pretty strict for airstrikes. But of course, even with those strict rules of engagement, several years later in 2015, we managed to bomb a Doctors Without Borders hospital in Kunduz, and we killed over 40 people. But after the Obama presidency, partly due to our campaign against ISIS, things really became loose. And I'm wondering if you can walk us through that.
Well, I mean, this is very complicated. There's a lot that goes into this. What's interesting is the PPG, the presidential policy guidance, it doesn't really apply to Afghanistan. It applies to other theaters outside of Iraq and Afghanistan, but it was sort of accepted as a norm by combatant commanders in Afghanistan and Iraq. The actual PPG, the terminology alters just slightly between Obama and Trump. I mean, there are some cases where they use the term near certainty versus reasonable certainty. And then it gets into the real question where the rubber meets the asphalt is how the PPG is interpreted and reinterpreted by commanders on the ground, in this case in Afghanistan. And, a lot of that does have to do with politics, but it is military leaders who are formulating the ROE with consultation of military lawyers, but the commanders own the ROE. Those are military ROEs. And so it's not so easy to just put them on Obama or Trump and blame, quote unquote, the politicians. They were actually formed and owned by military commanders. But in the article, I try to take some time to explain exactly what you were just alluding to there, that the ROEs were very restrictive at certain times, arguably too restrictive. And many of the soldiers and veterans out there who complain about the ROE being too restrictive, I mean, they're not wrong. There are valid criticisms here. The instance where the Doctors Without Borders hospital bombing, I mean, earlier in that battle, the Battle of Kunduz, they were trying to call in an airstrike on a Taliban tank, like literally a tank driving around Kunduz, and they were being told no. What I try to show in the article is how those rules of engagement were loosened over time. And largely that was in response to the battle against ISIS in Iraq. And we developed strike cell operations. We moved from doing intelligence-driven targeting to using a target engagement criteria. So in the battle against ISIS, this is no, semi-permissive environment. This is no counterterrorism campaign like the likes of which I was involved in back in 2005 or 2009 or whenever. This is war. This is combat. We're fighting a war of attrition against an enemy army in built-up urban areas in Iraq. So the ROEs had to loosen up, and we had to, start targeting the enemy heavily. And so the target engagement criteria could be things like fairly clear cut in some cases, like the guy's carrying an AK-47. Pretty, we're talking about a hostile armed actor carrying weapons in a war zone. That's fairly clear cut. Once you do deconfliction, make sure it's not, friendly forces. But the rules of engagement could be met by other things as well. The target engagement criteria could be met if the person was carrying a radio around, talking into a radio, for instance. In Mosul, it got to the point where if there were a certain number of cars parked outside of a residence, we would just blow up the residence, just level it, because there were so many SVB IEDs out there. For people who don't know, it's a suicide vehicular-borne improvised explosive device. Sorry for the long acronyms, but basically it's a car bomb being driven by somebody. And because there were so many of these in Mosul, we would just blow up a home if there were too many cars parked out in front. And what happened was that this target engagement criteria did help us win the war. I mean, there was a lot of collateral damage in Iraq and in Mosul as well. But I think it's at least somewhat understandable that we were fighting a different type of war, and that the type of targeting we did had to change to meet those new criterias. But then that method of targeting, strike cell operations and using a target engagement criteria, migrated its way over to Afghanistan by 2015, 2016, started making its way over there. By the time we get to 2018, 2019, it is pretty solid and in place.
When you say target engagement criteria, what you're really talking about is there might be somebody walking around in Helmand province with a radio, and they walk into a compound, and that justifies blowing up that compound. But what you also talk about in the article is that the Taliban had been blowing up the Roshan cell towers. So a lot of just Afghan civilians who had no connection to the Taliban were using these two-way radios just to carry about their daily business. So it was really hard to know who was who. And yet these people were still getting literally blown away for just walking around with a radio. Am I wrong?
Yeah, no, that's right. The Taliban had been dismantling the cell phone towers for years, so the only way people really had to communicate in Helmand was using these handheld walkie-talkies or two-way radios. And the target engagement criteria could be met in Helmand in 2019 by seeing somebody speaking into a radio, carrying a radio, just touching a radio at some point. For a drone pilot to just think they saw a flash of a radio underneath someone's clothes, or to think they saw the imprint of an antenna underneath their clothes, or in some cases, they might think they saw a flash of a tactical vest underneath clothing. All of those things would meet the target engagement criteria. There was no one on the ground for these strikes. And that is an important distinction. So the strike cell operations are done from an office, from a tactical operations center at Sharab. Was a camp that they did a lot of this stuff from. So there is no call for fire on the ground. There is no intelligence on the ground. There are no friendly forces on the ground that we are defending. It is purely what would happen is Scan Eagle drones would take off in the morning. They would fly into a grid square, and they would use their cameras to look for people who might meet the target engagement criteria that I had just mentioned. Once they did, then they would call in usually Gray Eagle drones. These are the armed drones that are actually flown by Army pilots, and they would actually do the strike itself. The other thing that was happening during this time frame was we were in negotiations in Doha trying to negotiate our exit from Afghanistan with the Taliban. And as a part of that negotiation strategy, we had put a pressure campaign in place on the Taliban. There would be people in the room in Doha looking at their watches, knowing that a strike is about to happen in Afghanistan on the buddies of the people they're sitting across the table from. That was a very deliberate strategy. But now what happens is that you're going back to Vietnam era body counts. That you are, the metric for success is the number of strikes you're doing, the number of people you're killing every day. And if commanders on the ground know that, they are going to do things. This is basic organizational psychology. They're going to do things to make themselves look as good as possible and make it look like they're doing as good a job in achieving the commander's intent to the best of their ability. And that means, in some case, at least in this case, striking people, whether they were enemy combatants or not.
Jonathan Schroden has a good quote in your article, and he's an analyst at CNA, and we've had him on panels at the Quincy Institute. He says that theory of victory leads you naturally to body counts as a metric, but that it might just be blunt force trauma. And in fact, one of your other sources kind of defined this strategy of targeting as a waiting for them to fuck up. That's a direct quote, waiting for them to fuck up culture of targeting.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very Orwellian, dystopian kind of way to think about it. But I mean, I think it did get to that point where you have this sort of unblinking eye, the surveillance eye, hovering over civilian populations of Afghanistan, quote unquote, waiting for them to fuck up. Like, guy doesn't tie his shoes the right way. I mean, I'm being sarcastic, but I mean, the guy touches a walkie-talkie and he fucked up. We're gonna kill him now. So, I mean, I think it explains a lot of the animosity that people had towards us.
What do you think the effect of this was on drone operators?
Some of these guys are traumatized, not just the pilots, but other people involved in the strike cell process as well. And, as a former infantry guy myself, I'm probably the first person who would scoff at that. Like, you guys are playing video games up there. What are you traumatized about? What's the deal with this? But through talking to them, I came to understand it, because they have these drone operators follow these people around and watch them. And it can be very intimate, that you're watching their daily life and following them around for hours and days at a time. The cameras are sophisticated enough at this point that you can zoom in and you can see whether the person is wearing eyeglasses or not. I mean, and I'm sure there's probably classified systems that are much better than that, but this is like just run of the mill Scan Eagle drones. The cameras are that good on them. So they're kind of getting up close and personal with the people that they're targeting. After they're targeted and the person is killed, you're witnessing, I mean, sometimes they survive the first blast and they have to come in with a second strike and finish them off. And then their responsibilities shift to watching the bodies. And they have to zoom in and look at the bodies, including dead children in some cases, and wait to see who shows up to claim the bodies, and then throw them on the back of a truck, and then drive them to a morgue or some other place, and then watch the family to come pick up the bodies of their dead loved ones, and seeing the mothers crying. And I mean, they witness all of this. So there's a significant moral injury that these people incur, especially when they are a part of lethal strikes that they feel are immoral or unethical.
Yeah, there's a really intense quote in your piece where an operator describes a woman, and he says, or they say that she was on her knees next to this guy with bald fists out at the sky, shaking her fists at me. So it felt personal to that operator.
Yeah, it was personal for him. And the woman too on the ground, like we kind of like have a tendency to, because I don't speak Pashto and I haven't been to Afghanistan in many years. I mean, we all have a distance from the people there, and it's easy to dehumanize them. But the people in Afghanistan, this is a civilian population that is being heavily targeted every day, just about. I mean, they're not dumb. They know what's going on. They know there's a drone up above, and they know they're being watched as they're there next to their dead husband. So I mean, she wasn't just shaking her fist at the air in anger. She was shaking her fist at the person flying the drone. She knew perfectly damn well what was going on there.
After doing this investigation, I've seen various reactions to it, especially from other vets. Some have said, "Yeah, this was a real problem." Some have dismissed the findings and said, "Oh, most of the strikes were fine." What do you think about those reactions? And also, if you could speak to, are there any lessons that can be applied to the future, especially as we move into a so-called over the horizon posture?
Well, I think the reactions can be explained by a few different things. Again, I think there are veterans out there who are quite frustrated by restrictive ROEs, where, in some cases we had guys who were actually under fire and they were not allowed to call in airstrikes. Times where we absolutely had a ethical and moral obligation to do everything we could to support our soldiers on the ground, and because of some bureaucratic bullshit, we didn't. So I think there's an understandable frustration. I think in other cases, there is a real predilection for us as veterans to try to protect our experiences and our own memories of the good times and the things that we enjoyed, and the camaraderie and all of the good things that we enjoyed about the military. And we don't want to taint those memories with something like this. So we reject the negative aspects of war and combat in order to protect ourselves and to protect our own personal history. And this becomes a even more difficult endeavor now, as a lot of guys are having to ask themselves some really difficult questions about Afghanistan and about the war there, and Iraq for that matter. What did it mean? What was it for?